Paris 1889. The year of the Exposition Universelle. The year the Eiffel Tower was completed, the iron lattice that rose above the city like a promise of the modern age. The year that 3 million visitors came to Paris to see the future. The city of light. But every city has its shadows. And in the shadow of the most celebrated city in the world, in the crooked streets of the 11th arrondissement, in the specific darkness of the Bastille neighborhood where the working poor and the artists and the anarchists had always lived together in the specific democracy of poverty, there was a street called Rue de Lappe. Rue de Lappe was a short street, barely 200 meters long, lined with the specific buildings of a neighborhood that had never been beautiful and had stopped pretending to be. The bal musette dance halls, the accordion music drifting from open windows on summer nights, the ginks where wine was cheap, the spaces that existed in the margins of the city's official life. And in the year 1889, there was a door on Rue de Lappe. Nothing distinguished it from the other doors on the street. But to the men who knew, to the men who had been told in the specific coded language of a community that communicated in whispers, the door was the entrance to the only place in Paris where they could be exactly what they were. My name is Edouard Marchand. I was 24 years old. I was a compositor at a printing house near the Place de la République. And the story I am about to tell you is the story of the night I walked through that door. And the man I found on the other side of it. Let me tell you what Paris was in 1889. It was the most modern city in the world and also a city in which men like me risked imprisonment for the simple act of being what we were. The legal situation in France was complicated. The Penal Code of 1791 had decriminalized consensual same-sex acts between adults. France was more progressive in this legal sense than Britain, where men were imprisoned under the Laboture Amendment, or Germany, where paragraph 175 made same-sex relations a criminal offense. But legal tolerance was not the same as social acceptance. The police of Paris in 1889 maintained a file less pederasts. They called us in the specific vocabulary of official contempt. Officers conducted surveillance in the parks and the public gardens and the places where men like me sometimes gathered. The social consequences of discovery, the loss of employment, the loss of family, the specific destruction of a reputation in a society that valued reputation above most things, these consequences were as real as imprisonment. We existed in the margins. We found each other in the margins. And the margins in 1889 Paris sometimes took the form of a door on Rue de Lappe. I had heard about it from Auguste, who was a typesetter at the printing house and who was the only man I knew who understood what I was because he was the same thing. Auguste was cautious in his life. He was 32 and had been cautious for 32 years, and the caution had preserved him. He had told me about Rue de Lappe in the specific careful way of someone transmitting information that could destroy both speaker and listener if it fell into the wrong hands. He said, "There is a house I have not been myself. I know a man who has been. He says it is safe. He says there is a proprietor, a woman named Celeste, who has maintained the space for 15 years and who has not been troubled by the police because she has certain arrangements. He said, I am not telling you to go, I am telling you that it exists." I was 24 years old and I had been alone with what I was for 24 years. I went. Paris at night in 1889 was a specific city. The gaslights on the main boulevards gave way to narrower streets where the darkness was more honest. The Bastille neighborhood at 11 p.m. was alive with the sound of the accordion from the dance halls and the specific murmur of a working-class neighborhood that did not keep the hours of the bourgeois quartier. I had dressed carefully. Not in my work clothes, the compositor's apron and the ink-stained shirts were for the printing house, but not in anything that would mark me as wealthy either, because wealth in the Bastille neighborhood attracted a different kind of attention. Plain dark trousers, a coat of adequate quality, a hat, the specific invisibility of a young man who looked like he belonged to the neighborhood without belonging to any particular story in it. I found Rue de Lappe by the route Auguste had described, through the Place de la Bastille down the Rue de la Roquette, left at the épicerie with the broken shutter. The street was what I had expected. Short, dark, the sound of accordion music from one of the dance halls, a dog sleeping in a doorway, the smell of the river not far enough away. I counted the doors. The fifth door on the left. A blue door, Auguste had said, though the blue is so faded now it is almost gray. I found it. I stood before it for a long time. A young man standing before a door at 11 p.m. in the Bastille neighborhood of Paris in 1889. No one would think twice about it. People stood before doors all the time. They were deciding whether to knock. They were building up the specific courage that ordinary actions required when the stakes were high enough to make them extraordinary. I knocked. A small panel in the door opened, an eye, a woman's eye dark and assessing. A voice said, "Who sent you?" I said, "I was told by a friend who was told by someone." A pause. "Which printing house?" Auguste had mentioned this. The password was not a word but a confirmation of connection. I said, "The one near the République." The panel closed. A moment. The door opened. The woman who opened it was perhaps 50. She was not what I had imagined, not the theatrical creature of the sensational press that occasionally reported on such establishments. She was a woman in a good black dress with gray-streaked hair and the specific expression of someone who had seen everything twice and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She said, "Céleste, you are welcome here, behave yourself and respect the others. The fee is 2 francs and it includes wine." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Come in." I came in. The interior of the house on Rue de Lappe was not what the imagination would construct. No red velvet and theatrical darkness, no elaborate performance of vice. It was a series of rooms on the ground floor of an ordinary building that had been made, by the specific effort of a woman with taste and practical intelligence, into something warm and human, and for the men who came here safe. A large room with chairs and tables where wine was being served. A smaller room with a piano where a young man was playing something that was not quite classical and not quite café music, but was instead exactly the music this room required, unassuming, present, not demanding attention. And men. Perhaps 20 men, a range of ages, working men in their weekday clothes, 2 who looked like students. 1, impossible to miss, in the fine coat of someone who did not usually spend his evenings in the Bastille neighborhood and who was sitting in the corner with the specific careful stillness of a man who was very aware of how far he had traveled from his usual world. I took a glass of wine from a tray. I found a chair at the edge of the room. I sat. I looked. In 24 years of managing what I was, I had never been in a room where the men around me were the same. Not one. Not in the printing house, not in the street, not in the family apartment in the 3rd arrondissement where my parents and my sister lived. The specific quality of not being the only one. It arrived in my chest like something released, not dramatically, the quiet arrival of something that had been too tightly held. I sat in the corner of a room on Rue de Lappe and I breathed. And the man across the room looked up from his wine. And our eyes met. And he held my gaze for a moment in the specific way that means something, in any context, in any century. He looked away. I held my wine. He was perhaps 28, dark hair that was slightly too long for the fashion of the respectable classes. A coat that had been good quality once and was now the coat of someone who had kept it past its intended life because they had not yet replaced it. Long hands around his wine glass. He was looking at the piano player. But he had looked at me. I stayed for 2 hours that first night. I drank my wine and I listened to the piano and I watched the room with the specific hunger of someone who has been starved of a thing and is now in the presence of it. I spoke to no one. The man across the room, I watched him in the peripheral way that I had learned to watch things that I was not supposed to be watching. He spoke to an older man beside him for a while. He laughed at something. And the laugh was different from the way men laugh in public, less performed, more genuine. At one point he looked toward the piano and his expression was, I have no better word for it, the expression of someone for whom beauty was still surprising. At midnight Céleste moved through the room with the specific efficiency of a woman managing a complex operation and said that the evening was concluding. The men rose. The piano player finished his piece. The room began its departure in the careful sequence of men who knew they could not all leave at once and who had learned the specific choreography of inconspicuousness. I put on my coat. I moved toward the door, and the man with the dark hair was also moving toward the door. And for a moment in the narrow space between the wine table and the entrance we were beside each other. He said without looking at me, "Beautiful playing tonight." I said, "Yes, very," and then he was through the door and into the night. And I stood in the street and I looked at the faded blue door and I thought, I am coming back. I returned the following Thursday. Not the next evening. Caution was the fundamental practice of a man in my position, and returning immediately to a place that carried risk would have been the specific recklessness that destroyed men like me in 1889. But Thursday, a week later, the same route, the same blue-gray door, the same panel opening. I gave the connection and the door opened and Celeste nodded at me with the specific recognition of someone who remembers faces because her business depends on it. The same room. The same piano player, a different piece tonight, something more melancholy and more beautiful. And the man with the dark hair. He was at the same chair he had occupied the previous week. As if the chair were his by some unspoken arrangement, his coat was the same, the wine glass held in the same long hands. He looked up when I entered. He recognized me. The recognition was visible, a slight adjustment of the expression, the specific involuntary response of someone who had been thinking about a face and has now seen it again. I found a chair that was closer than last week. Not beside him, the table adjacent. The distance of two people who are aware of each other without having established the right to be closer. We sat. The piano played. At some point he said without preamble, as if continuing a conversation we had already been having, "You are new here." I said, "My second visit." He said, "I thought so." I said, "You have been coming here longer." He said, 2 years. 2 years while I had been alone with what I was. He had been finding this room every week. I said, "How did you find it?" He said, "A painter I know, he frequents the artists' circles in Montmartre." He said, "I know a place that might interest you." I said, "A painter?" He said, "Yes, he is extraordinary, he comes here sometimes, he draws everything." I said, "And no one minds?" He said, "Celeste minds, but the painter is discreet and she likes the drawings." He gave her one. I held my wine. He said, "I am Henry." I said, "Edouard." He said, "You work near the République." I said, "Yes, a printing house, I am a compositor." He said, "You set the type." I said, "Yes, by hand still, though the mechanical presses are coming." He said, "And you read everything you print?" I said, "Every word, it is impossible not to." He said, "What do you print?" I said, "Everything, newspapers, political pamphlets. This week we are printing a monograph on the exposition, the Eiffel Tower." He said, "And what do you think of the tower?" I said, "I think it is the most honest building in Paris. It does not pretend to be made of anything other than what it is made of." He held his wine. He said, "That is an interesting way to love something." I said, "I am not sure I love it, but I respect it." He said, "What do you love?" I held my wine. I said, "That is a question I am still working on." He said, "How old are you?" I said, 24. He said, 24 is a good age for still working on things. I said, "And you?" He said, 29, old enough to know some answers, young enough to still be afraid of them. The piano played something that was neither happy nor sad and was both simultaneously. I said, "Henry." He said, "Yes." I said, "What do you do when you are not here?" He said, "I am a pharmacist, my family has a pharmacy in the Marais." I said, "A pharmacist from the Marais who spends Thursday evenings in the Bastille." He said, "The Marais and the Bastille are not so far apart." I said, "In distance, no." He said, "In other ways either. The Bastille was built to protect the Marais or to contain it, depending on who is writing the history." I said, "And which is it?" He said, "Both, always both." I held my wine. I thought about protection and containment. I thought about what it meant that both things could be true simultaneously. We fell into it without planning it. The word "fell" is the right one, not the dramatic fall of a certain kind of story. The gradual fall of a hillside, the slow movement of something that begins so gently you do not notice it until you look back and see how far you have moved. He was always at his chair. I arrived and found the adjacent table. We talked. About the city, about our work, about the specific texture of our lives in a Paris that was celebrating itself at the exposition while we occupied its underside. He told me about his family's pharmacy in the Marais. His father, who had built the business from a single small shop into something respectable. His mother, who knew the names and ailments of every family on their street. His younger sister, who wanted to be a schoolteacher and would, in the new century, probably become one. He told me these things with the specific quality of someone describing a world they belonged to and also did not fully belong to. The family pharmacy. The respectable Marais. The place where Henry Beaumont the pharmacist existed and Henry the man who came to Rue de Lappe on Thursday evenings did not. I recognized this. I told him about the printing house. About Auguste, who had told me about Rue de Lappe with the specific careful language of a man protecting both of them. About the smell of the ink and the physical satisfaction of setting type, the individual letters assembling into words, into sentences, into arguments and stories and records of the world. He said, "You are making the record of the world." I said, "Small parts of it." He said, "Small parts are the record, the large history is assembled from small parts." I said, "The compositor's philosophy." He said, "I meant it seriously." I said, "I know." In the fourth week he told me about the previous year. There had been a man, a musician, they had met at Céleste's and had been something for 8 months. The musician had been offered a position in Lyon and had taken it. He said he wrote for 3 months and then the letters stopped. I said, "Were you?" He said, "Heartbroken, I do not know, I was something, the something did not have an available vocabulary." I said, "The vocabulary of men like us is a limited one." He said, "Yes, we are improvising language for a life that has not yet been named." I held my wine. I said, "In the pamphlets I print sometimes, the political ones, they are beginning to use certain words, from the German writing, the sexology." He said, "I have read some of it, Ulrich's and the newer work." I said, "And what do you think of the new vocabulary?" He said, "I think words are useful when they help you understand what you are, and I think they become a cage if you live inside them too fully." I said, "The pharmacist with opinions about language." He said, "The compositor who respects the Eiffel Tower for its honesty." I held my wine. He held his. We were at the adjacent tables in Céleste's room on Rue de Lappe, and the piano player was playing something I recognized from a concert I had attended in the spring, something by Saint-Saëns, improperly remembered by a pianist of modest ability but with the specific quality of someone who loved the music regardless of their technical limitations. I said, "Henry." He said, "Yes." I said, "I would like to see you outside of here." He was quiet. I said, "I understand if that is." He said, "No, I know a place, a café, it is not in this neighborhood, it is in the 5th, near the Jardin des Plantes." I said, "A café in the 5th. He said, "We would be 2 men having coffee, which is what we would be." I said, "And also something else." He said, "Also something else, but the surface would hold." I said, "Sunday morning." He said, "Sunday morning." The café was on the Rue Buffon near the garden. Sunday morning in Paris in 1889 had the specific quality of a city that had remembered to breathe. The families walking toward Mass, the children with their hoops in the streets, the sellers with their bread. The particular light of a Paris Sunday that arrived softer than the weekday version, as if the city were allowing itself a modicum of peace. I arrived at the café first. He arrived 3 minutes later. In the daylight he was different and the same. The dark hair that was slightly too long, the coat that had been good quality once, but in the daylight also, the intelligence of his eyes which in the gaslit room on Rue de Lappe had been visible but which in the morning light of a Sunday street were completely unguarded. He sat across from me. The waiter brought coffee. We were 2 men having coffee near the Jardin des Plantes. He said, "You look different in the morning." I said, "You do also." He said, "The night version of a person is always different." I said, "How am I different?" He said, "Younger and more," he paused, "more present, at Céleste's everyone is slightly elsewhere watching themselves from a distance." I said, "The habit of men who have always had to watch themselves." He said, "Yes." I said, "And here?" He said, "Here you are simply sitting across from me drinking coffee." I said, "That is all I am doing." He said, "Yes." He held his coffee. He said, "Edouard." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "Tell me." He held the coffee cup. He said, "The musician who went to Lyon." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was careful with him, the entire time we were, whatever we were, I was careful, I never said the things I was thinking, I never let myself." He stopped. I said, let yourself what? He said, be in it completely. I was always managing a door, keeping one hand on it in case I needed to leave quickly. I said, in case it went wrong. He said, in case he was not what I thought, in case the thing between us was not what it seemed, in case, he stopped again. I said, in case caring too much made it hurt more when it ended. He held the coffee. He said, yes. I said, Henry. He said, yes. I said, I have been alone with what I am for 24 years. I have been careful my entire life. I have managed the door for 24 years. He said, yes. I said, I would like to stop managing it. He held the coffee. He looked at me. In the morning light of a café on Rue de Lappe in the 5th arrondissement of Paris in 1889. He said, that requires courage. I said, yes. He said, I am not sure I have it. I said, I am not sure I have it either. I said, but I am more afraid of managing the door for another 24 years than I am of what happens if I open it. He held the coffee. The Sunday morning. The café. The people of Paris passing on the street outside. He said, Edouard. I said, yes. He said, would you like to walk in the Jardin des Plantes? I said, yes. He said, two men walking in a garden. I said, it would not be only that. He said, no, but the surface would hold. I said, yes. He said, then let us walk. We walked. The Jardin des Plantes in September 1889 was the specific beauty of a Parisian garden at the end of summer, the beginning of the gold, the air still warm enough for shirt sleeves in the afternoon. We walked for 2 hours. We talked about everything and nothing in the specific mixture of two people who are learning each other and who are also being careful and who are also, despite the carefulness, being more honest than they have been with anyone in a very long time. He told me about his grandmother who had survived the Commune of 1871, who had been 16 years old when the barricades went up in the streets, and who had told him that the most important thing she had learned in that year was that the world could change very quickly and that the only thing worth holding on to was the people you chose. He said, she meant it about family, about surviving, but I have thought about it differently. I have thought about it as something about choice. About the people you actively choose rather than the people circumstance assigns you. We stopped at the Gallery of Paleontology, the enormous bones of creatures that had not existed for millions of years arranged in the long room. He looked at the bones of an ancient animal and he said, they were the dominant life form of their era, and then the world changed. And I said, and they could not adapt. And he said, or the world changed faster than anything could adapt to. And I thought about the world we were living in. The one that was changing fast enough to build an iron tower in 2 years but not fast enough to stop calling men like us by the name in the police file. And I thought, the bones of the animals remind us that every era ends, and that what comes after may not look like what came before, and that this is not always a terrible thing. And I held that thought, and beside me Henry Beaumont held his coat against the evening chill coming into the gallery. And I thought, I am choosing this person. Whatever comes of it, I am choosing. October arrived in Paris the way October arrived in Paris, all at once, with the specific efficiency of a city that did not sentimentalize the seasons. The exposition was ending. The visitors who had come to see the future were returning to their various presents. The Eiffel Tower remained, it would remain, against the wishes of the writers and artists who had signed the petition against it, who had called it the Tower of Babel, who had not understood that the future does not ask permission. Henry and I had established a pattern. Thursday evenings at Céleste's, where we sat at adjacent tables and talked and were surrounded by the specific warmth of men who understood what we were. Sunday mornings at the café on Rue de Lappe, where we were two men having coffee and also something else. And sometimes, increasingly, other evenings. I had begun to know the Marais differently because of him. He knew its streets the way people know the streets of a neighborhood they were born in, not by the names but by what had happened on them. He said, this is where the old market was. He said, my father's first shop was in that building before it was demolished. He had begun to know the Bastille neighborhood because of me. He knew it through the printing house and through Auguste and through the specific geography of the 11th arrondissement as I had learned it by walking, by the quality of the light at different hours, by the sound of the accordion from the dance halls. We were learning each other through the city we shared. One evening in October, a Wednesday, not our usual day, I had a crisis at the printing house. A mechanical press had broken during a run and the print order was late and my supervisor had kept the compositors an extra 3 hours. And by the time I reached the street, it was nearly midnight and I was tired in the specific way of someone whose body and mind have both been demanded of for too long. I had not planned to go to Henry's neighborhood. But my feet, which had been walking the marais more often lately, took me there. I stood on his street. I could not knock on his door, that was not something men like us did. The pharmacy was closed. The family apartment above it was dark at midnight. I stood on the street, and the window above the pharmacy opened. He looked down. He had been awake. He said quietly, not wanting to wake the street, "Edouard." I said I was walking. He said, "At midnight." I said, "Yes." He said, "Wait 2 minutes." He appeared at the pharmacy door. He had put his coat over his nightclothes. His hair was disordered from bed. He looked more like himself than he usually did. He said, "Come in through the pharmacy, my parents are asleep." I said I should not. He said, "Come in." I came in. The pharmacy at midnight smelled of camphor and dried herbs and the specific chemical clarity of a place where medicine was made. The shelves of bottles and jars in the moonlight through the windows. He lit a small lamp. He said, "What happened?" I told him about the press and the long evening. He listened. He did not offer solutions, he listened. When I finished, he said, "Are you hungry?" I said no. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes, I think I just needed." I stopped. He said, "What did you need?" I held the lamp light. I said, "I needed to be somewhere that knew me." He held the lamp. He said, "This is somewhere that knows you." I said, "Yes." He said, "Edouard." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have been careful for 29 years. I said, "I know." He said, "And the carefulness has kept me safe." I said, "Yes." He said, "And also very alone." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am tired of being safely alone." I held the lamp light. He said, "I want to stop managing the door." I said, "Henry." He said, "Yes." I said, "You told me 2 weeks ago you were not sure you had the courage." He said, "I have been working on it." I said, "And?" He held the lamp. He said, "I love you." He said it with the specific quality of someone who has made a calculation and is giving the result without softening it. Not "I think I love you," not something that resembles love, the direct version. In the pharmacy on a midnight in October 1889. With his hair disordered from bed and his coat over his nightclothes and the bottles and jars on the shelves around us. I held the lamp light. I said, "I love you too." I said, "Since the first week, since you said, 'Beautiful playing tonight' without looking at me." He said, "That was my most elaborate declaration." I said it was sufficient. He said it was terrifying. I said I know, I could tell. He said, "Could you?" I said, "You said it to the door." He said I was practicing on the door. I held the lamp light. I said, "Henry Beaumont." He said, "Yes." I said, "I am going to hold your hand now." He said, "In the pharmacy." I said, "Yes." He said, "My father is asleep upstairs." I said, "Yes." He said, "Edouard." I said, "Yes." He said, "Hold my hand." I held his hand. In the pharmacy on the Marais at midnight in October 1889. The bottles and jars on the shelves around us. The lamp between us. The city of Paris sleeping on the other side of the window. November, December. The world did not end. This is the thing I want to say clearly. The world did not end. The specific fear that men like us carried, the fear that the management of the door was the only thing standing between us and catastrophe, it did not prove itself correct. Nothing was simple. I want to be clear about that too. We were not living in a world that had become safe for us. The police files still existed. The social consequence of discovery was still real. Henry's family upstairs in the pharmacy apartment did not know the full truth of their son. But the world did not end. We found the specific ways that people find when they are determined to have something the world would prefer they did not have. The Thursday evenings continued. The Sunday coffees continued. The Wednesday nights in the pharmacy when his parents were visiting cousins in the 7th became another pattern. He came to the printing house once, not inside where August and the others worked, but to the street outside at the end of the day. He said he had been delivering a remedy to a patient nearby. He had passed coincidentally. We walked together for 4 blocks. 4 blocks. In the specific complicated arithmetic of our situation, 4 blocks together in public was both ordinary and extraordinary. August noticed. He said at the type trays the following morning without looking at me, "You seem different this month." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Less alone." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He said nothing else. He said his type, I set mine. The press ran. We printed the news of the world. Henry asked me in December, a question I had not expected. We were in the cafe on Rue Buffin. Sunday, the December coffee was better because December demanded better coffee. He said, "Edouard." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "Tell me." He held his coffee. He said, "My cousin is a pharmacist in Bordeaux. He has a good practice. He has been writing to me since September about a partnership he is proposing." I said, "A partnership?" He said he wants to expand his practice. He has been asking if I would consider coming to Bordeaux. I held my coffee. He said, "The Marais pharmacy will go to my brother eventually. My father has not said this, but I know it to be true. My brother is the one who has been in the business since childhood. I came to it later." I said, "And you are considering Bordeaux?" He said, "I am considering the question." I said, "What does the question involve?" He said, "It involves whether the life I have here is the full version of what I want." I said, "And is it?" He held his coffee. He said, "The life I have here includes Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights in the pharmacy." He held the cup. "And it also includes a great deal of management." I said, "Yes." He said, "Bordeaux is not Paris, but it is also not." He stopped. I said, "Not the Marais." He said, "Not the world where I am Henry, the pharmacist's son who everyone has known since he was born." I said, "Somewhere that does not have an existing story about you." He said, "Yes." I held my coffee. I held it for a long moment. I said, "Henry." He said, "Yes." I said, "Are you asking me a question?" He held his coffee. He said, "I am asking whether." He stopped. He began again. "My cousin's proposal is for a partnership. He has a house with a second floor that has been unoccupied since his wife's mother passed." I said, "A second floor?" He said, "Yes." I held my coffee. I said, "Are you asking me to come to Bordeaux?" He said, "I am asking if it is something you would consider." I said, "The printing houses in Bordeaux." He said, "The printing industry in Bordeaux is significant. There are newspapers and a university press." I said, "You have researched the printing industry in Bordeaux?" He said, "I have been thorough." I held my coffee. I said, "A compositor in a Bordeaux printing house?" He said, "Living on the second floor of a house where a pharmacist's partnership has been established." I said, "Two men?" He said, "Two men who are colleagues, friends, sharing a house near the pharmacy." I said, "The surface would hold." He said, "The surface would hold, and underneath it." He stopped. I said, "Underneath it?" He said, "Underneath it would be the actual version." I held my coffee. The cafe on Rue Buffin. The December Paris outside. The city of light that had taught us how to live in its shadows and that would also, when we were ready, release us into a life that was more than shadows. I said, "Henry Beaumont." He said, "Edouard Marchand." I said, "I would like to live on the second floor of a house in Bordeaux." He held his coffee. He held it for a very long moment. He said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." He said, "It will not be simple." I said, "I know." He said, "The world is not, we will still need to be careful." I said, "I know." He said, "But." I said, "But we will have the actual version, underneath." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is enough." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is." He stopped. He looked at the coffee, at the December street outside. "That is more than I have had before." I said, "More than I have had before too." He said, "Is it enough?" I said, "For now it is enough, and enough has the specific quality of being able to become more, given time." He held his coffee. He looked at me. In the December light of a café near the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, in 1889. He said, "The compositor and the pharmacist." I said, "The pharmacist and the compositor." He said, "In Bordeaux." I said in Bordeaux. He said on the second floor. I said on the second floor. He said two men. I said two men who chose each other. He held his coffee. Edouard, he said. Yes. I am glad I said beautiful playing tonight without looking at you. So am I. I was practicing on the door. I know. I was afraid. I know. And now. I held my coffee. I looked at Henry Beaumont, the dark hair slightly too long, the coat that had been good quality once and was now exactly what it was, the long hands, the eyes that were more honest in the daylight than they were in any other light. I said, now you're practicing something else. He said, what am I practicing? I said, being in it completely. He held the coffee. He said, yes. He said, I am. The café. The December Paris. The century almost over. The one to come carrying none of us knew yet, both worse and better than what we had. But in December 1889, at a café table, two men held their coffee and made a plan for a life that was more than shadows. They left Paris in March. The letter to the Bordeaux cousin had been written and answered. The arrangement at the printing house in Paris had been concluded with the specific professional courtesy of 2.5 years of good work. Auguste had shaken Edouard's hand and said, write when you are settled. Edouard wrote, I will. They did not travel together to Bordeaux. Henry went first to establish the pharmacy partnership. Edouard followed 2 weeks later, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon at the Bordeaux train station in the March light that was already more southern than the Paris light, warmer, more generous, the specific light of a city on the river that had always been more open to the sea and to whatever the sea brought in. Henry was at the station. He was standing on the platform in his coat. He had not told Edouard he would be there. He had said he would have someone from the pharmacy meet him. He was there himself. He said, you look like you have been traveling. Edouard said, 4 hours on a train. He said, the house is ready. Edouard said, the second floor. He said, the second floor. He said, the room has a window that faces east. I thought you would like the morning light. Edouard held his bag. He said, Henry. He said, yes. He said, you are the most thoroughly prepared person I have ever known. He said, I am a pharmacist, preparation is the practice. He said, and you research the printing industry in Bordeaux. He said, in some detail. He said, and you had the eastern window ready. He said, yes. He said, Henry Beaumont. He said, Edouard Marchand. He said, I love you. On a train platform in Bordeaux on a March afternoon in 1890, with the southern light and the smell of the Garonne River and the other travelers moving around them with their ordinary purposes. Two men standing on a platform, one arriving, one waiting. Henry said, I love you too. He said, since beautiful playing tonight. He said, since you said it to the door. He said, I was terrified. He said, I know. He said, I am less terrified now. He said, yes. He said, the door is open. He said, yes. He said, come, I will show you the house. They walked from the station through the streets of Bordeaux toward the house near the pharmacy. Two men, walking in a city that did not know their story. In a city that would, in time, know some of it, the pharmacist and his colleague from Paris, the compositor who had found work at the university press, the two men who lived in the house near the Cours de l'Intendance. The surface would hold. Underneath the surface would be the actual version. The one that had begun in a room on Rue de Lappe with a piano playing something between classical and café music and a glass of wine in a gaslit room and a man who looked up from across the space and held a gaze for a moment longer than accident required. The one that had grown through Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings and a midnight in a pharmacy with a lamp and a hand held in the dark. The one that had taken courage neither of them had been sure they possessed. And had turned out in the end to require exactly as much courage as they had. Which was enough. Which was, in the specific arithmetic of men who had been managing doors for their entire lives, more than enough. Which was everything. This story is historical fiction inspired by the documented existence of underground queer spaces in 19th century Paris. Céleste's establishment on Rue de Lappe is fictional, though similar spaces are documented to have existed. The legal situation described, France's relative legal tolerance versus the social reality, is historically accurate. The experience of gay men in the Belle Epoque period was shaped by exactly this tension between legal decriminalization and social persecution. The characters of Edouard Marchand and Henry Beaumont are entirely fictional, as are all events in this story.